Okay, good evening. We are now in the fifth reading, the book of Genesis. This week's Torah portion is called Chaya, and Chaya means the life of Sarah. But in fact, what we learn about in this week's Torah portion is the death of Sarah. So this is Sarah, our foremother. Sarah, our foremother, married to Abraham. And we're into the fifth reading now. So we've had Genesis, we've created the world, we've had Noah, the story of the flood and how the whole world was destroyed, except for the land of Israel, we learn. And now we are moving into the story of Abraham. We have Abraham who left his home, if you remember, in the Parshat called Lech Lecha, when he leaves his home. And last week we had various other tests and challenges that God brought for Abraham and Sarah to bring them to their full potential, for them to be the forefathers and the foremothers of the Jewish people, that they're going to be the foundation of who we all learn from and grow from and can be like and use as our role models. So Abraham and Sarah. And in this week's Torah portion, at the beginning of the Torah portion, Sarah dies, and at the end of the Torah portion, Abraham dies. So this is the end of our stories about Abraham and Sarah. And last week we had the end of the Torah reading. We had the incident where the binding of Isaac, where Abraham takes his son, his only son, the one he loves, Isaac, who's the only child of Sarah, and he takes that child, not Ishmael. It's our tradition that the child that he took to bind was Isaac. I do believe that Muslims have that Ishmael was the one that was taken up to be shechted, to be offered up to God, but our tradition is that it was Isaac. That's what it says in the Torah. So God, at the end of last week's Torah portion, at the point where he's about to offer up his son Isaac, an angel comes, tells him to stop, and he stops. And he's not killed, although there are stories in our tradition that he died and he was brought back to life. That there was something happened to Isaac. He was blinded, his eyes were dimmed. We're not exactly sure what happened to Isaac, but he's not killed on the altar. And at this point, the end of last week's Torah portion that's where that ends. And then this week's Torah portion, we learn about the death of Sarah, and those two stories are juxtaposed: the binding of Isaac and the death of our foremother Sarah. So I'm going to read you the first 2 or 3 sentences, and really it's a launching pad for a lot of lessons that we can learn. Sarah's lifetime was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. 100 years, 20 years, 7 years. The years of Sarah's life. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to bewail her. Abraham rose up from the presence of his dead and spoke to the children of Heth, saying, I am an alien and a resident among you. Grant me an estate for a burial site with you, that I may bury my dead from before me. So the way in which Sarah's 127 years of life are described are that she lived 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. And there's a lot of commentary as why that's the language. Why doesn't it say that she was 127 years? Why does it divide it up like that? And why is the Torah portion called Chaya, the life of Sarah, when it's really about her death? And I think that is really the fundamental foundation of who we are as Jews. Right? We say l'chaim, we're into life, we're about life. So yes, we know we're going to die. There will be an end to our lives, but we live life almost as if we aren't going to die. We live life as if this is what we're working for. This is where we are now. This is what we're doing, and we live life fully, and we live life with passion and with vigor and with intention and with meaning. And it's about what we do in this life, not that we will die, which we know we will. And Sarah, our foremother, dies in this week's Torah portion, but it's about the fact that that's who we are, that's our legacy, that's what we leave behind when we go, is how we lived our lives. And it says that the righteous people never die, that even in death they're alive, that even when they're no longer here physically, there's no, as body and soul together, that is Sarah, our foremother, that even though that combination of her body and soul don't exist right now in this physical world, that her messages and her lessons live on beyond her, so that what we leave behind in the world hopefully has some amount of ripple effect, and that our good deeds continue to have an effect in the world, and that we continue to live on even after we die. And that's one of the messages of why the Torah portion is called Chaya Sarah. So why is it divided up that she's 100, that she's 20, and that she's 7? And there's a few different ideas here. One is that a very important idea, and we had a very interesting psychologist gave a presentation here this week about how to be a resilient person, and what a resilient person, who is a resilient person? Resilient person, according to this psychologist, is somebody who's able to take their life challenges and almost like a piece of steel that gets put into a furnace, it gets hardened by that and becomes stronger and becomes more able to weather the vicissitudes of life. That a resilient person has struggles and has challenges and has traumas and has losses and has all those things, but resiliency allows us not only perhaps to rebound back to the place that we were before that challenge came our way, but that we actually even maybe bounce forward. That there's such a terminology called post-trauma growth, that even in that after the challenges, after we've somehow integrated them, after we've somehow processed them, we've somehow like come to terms with things that happen in our lives, that we kind of move beyond that, and that this is perhaps the lesson that we learned from Abraham and Sarah through the different tests that they went through, and culminating last week with the binding of Isaac, and now moving into what's going to happen where Abraham is now going to negotiate with the owner of the land where the cave of Machpelah is, to purchase that land to bury his wife Sarah. Though it's difficult for him to negotiate with this person Ephron to buy the land. That's a struggle for him. But the point is that all of these things bring out the best of us, or hopefully they bring out the best of us, and hopefully through the challenges and through the struggles that we access parts of ourselves that we lie dormant or that were not actualized before. And so that post-traumatic growth. So what did Sarah do? She had, and the Torah here delineates 3 different phases in our life. So there's your childhood when you're 7, 7 years old, you're very innocent and you're very, trusting perhaps, and exuberant, and you're very curious about everything. That's your sort of 7-year-old self. That's your inner child. And then you move into your 20-year-old or your young adult, and you're very optimistic perhaps, and you want to be very independent, and you feel like you know everything, and you're very idealistic, and you're very optimistic. So that's your sort of young adult, 20-year-old. You want to be independent, and you want to kind of forge your own path, and you want to separate from your parents, and you want to like be your own person, and you're separating and becoming your own. And then when you're 100 years old, hopefully we get to be 100 and well and healthy, that we're wise and that we're mellow, and perhaps we're a little bit more dispassionately judgmental, we're more responsible, we're more able to kind of bring together all the lessons of our lives, and we can be more wise people perhaps. And what Sarah, this separation of her different ages suggests is that when she was 100, she was also 7. So when she was 20, she was also 100. So also 7. Like, she's bringing these different phases of her life. She doesn't leave them behind. She builds on them. That she becomes, when she's 20, she is like a 7-year-old. She has that innocence and that purity and that exuberance and that curiosity when she's 20. When she's 100, she's as beautiful as she was when she was 20. She was as zealous as she was when she was 20. That she didn't leave behind her youth. She didn't leave behind her childhood. That she took all of that. She brought it all with her. That she lived every day fully. That she was able to have an ability to learn from every day and to build on every day. So, we obviously go up and down, and sometimes we're growing and sometimes we're moving in the opposite direction. But the implication for Sarah, our foremother, is that she lived life so fully every single day that she didn't kind of go back. She kept building up and up and up. So by the time she was 127, she had reached the culmination of what she was to become. And then her time was done. Then she was finished and she died. There is a story, there is a medrash that tells us that she was so shocked by what Abraham was doing with Isaac, that he was taking Isaac up to sacrifice him, and that the angel of the Satan comes and tells her and shows her an image of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and that she's so upset by this vision and so upset by the possibility of her son Isaac dying, her only son, that she dies herself. That's one opinion. There's another opinion though that says that her life was done, that she had reached her full, allotted time that she'd been given in this world, and that she had lived it fully, and she had lived it like as a righteous person, and she was so full, like everything was like, she was so righteous that in fact when she died, that she went straight up to Gan Eden, she went straight into the Garden of Eden. And so what's Abraham doing? Abraham now, it says that she died in Kiryat Arba, which is very interesting that she died in Kiryat Arba, and which is Hebron, so it's still there. The cave of Machpelah is where Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebecca and Jacob and Leah are buried there, the four couples, and Adam and Eve are buried in the cave of Machpelah. And it says the cave of Machpelah is the entrance to the Garden of Eden. I don't really know what that means, but it's like the entrance to the Garden of Eden. And I don't know if you remember last week, after Abraham has his circumcision and he's sitting at the tent and he sees these three angels coming towards him, and he runs out to offer them hospitality, and he brings them into his tent and he wants to feed them the choicest of calves, and he runs after this calf that's running away from him, and he wants to catch it so that he can serve it to his guests, and he chases this calf into a cave. And the Medrash tells us that it's the cave of Machpelah. It's the cave where he runs into this cow, this little calf runs into this cave, and he goes in and he smells, whatever that means, he smells the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve are lying there. And he sees that they're lying there, and they speak with him, that we talked about that last week. But that's how we know, that's how Abraham knows that this is where he's to be buried, because this is a continuation. Abraham and Sarah, specifically at this point Sarah, because Abraham wants to purchase this cave specifically because Adam and Eve are buried in it, and he understands that this is where he's supposed to be buried. This is where the matriarchs and patriarchs are going to be buried. This is where the progenitors of the Jewish people are to be buried. This is the place, and he's been there as an alive person, recognizing this is where Adam and Eve are buried. And I heard some mystical teachings about when Adam and Eve sinned, and when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they're buried in the ground. They're buried there. They're buried in the cave of Machpelah. That the whole earth, because of what they had done, the whole earth sort of went down a level in spirituality. As much as we really can't quite understand what it means that physical things have a spiritual nature, but that is our tradition. That physical things have a capacity to be holy. We do that with a Torah scroll. We do that with a Siddur. We do that with a prayer book, with the written Torah that we have written. We don't throw these in the garbage. We don't burn them. We bury them, right? Where they're holy. They have acquired holiness because they have the Torah written on them. And so too, our bodies have acquired holiness by the combination of the Holy Soul that God breathes into our bodies, that our souls acquire spirituality and holiness. And so we can't dispense with our bodies however we want. We have to bury our bodies. We have to be careful with our bodies. We can't tattoo our bodies. We can't cut ourselves. We can't kill ourselves. There's a lot of things that are written into our tradition that speak about the nature of the body and the soul, and how our life is a gift, and this combination of body and soul is a gift, and that we have to take care of our bodies and we have to look after them. There's certain things we can't do and certain things we can do. We have to be healthy. We have to look after ourselves, etc., etc. But the point is that when Adam and Eve, when they sinned in the Garden of Eden, they took the earth down with them. Okay, whatever that means, like there was a lowering, and that was one of the reasons why the flood had to come and sort of wipe off all the surface of the earth, or the whole earth and the whole world had to start again, because it had gone down into such a low level of morality and low level of the opposite of spirituality, of going down. And so now we're going to build it up. And Sarah, being buried in the ground, said the mystical sources, elevates it back up. So now when Sarah is buried in this place, she's buried in the ground, she, by what she has become in her lifetime, elevates the whole earth. And it says actually that the land rises up. I actually find it, but it says that the land rises up to, essentially it's being elevated by her being buried in the ground, that she has an effect on the whole world by being buried in the ground. It elevates it. And then the Jewish people and all the things that happened to the Jewish people post Abraham and Sarah, all the miracles, all the splitting of the sea and the coming out of Egypt and all the plagues that we read about, that we're going to read about in the book of Exodus, all that is in the merit of Sarah being buried in the ground and what she became, and how Abraham and Sarah are able to elevate the world and raise it up. So that's kind of something to think about, like what we do, each one of us, when we do good deeds, when we bring kindness into the world, when we do good, we're elevating the world. We maybe can't touch it, can't feel it, but that's what we're doing. We're elevating the spiritual nature of the world. The whole world is being affected by what we do. And if we do it in secret and we do it in our basement, it doesn't matter. It still affects the whole world. Our prayers affect the whole world. No prayer goes unheard. It might not be answered the way we want to, but it's never not heard. All right. So this idea of Sarah and her life being one that was a building. It was continually building on each stage, going from the child, the 7-year-old, to the 20-year-old, the adolescent, the young adult, and then up into the old age. And she was able to take all of that with her and build on it and become the best person that she had the potential to become. And at 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, she had lived the full life, and it was time for her to die. So what does Abraham do? He eulogizes her and he bewails her, which is an interesting order. In our lives, as soon as somebody dies, we start crying, like that is such a loss for us. Like immediately we bewail our losses, and then we eulogize. The eulogy comes after the crying. And it's interesting, a lot of conversation about why it is that Abraham, he first eulogizes her and then he cries. So one of the understandings is that he understood that she had lived her full life. And yes, it was a loss to him, and he understood that he had lost his soulmate, that this was the woman that was his antithesis. He was the soul and she was the body, and they were sort of married to each other, but that they were a unit, and that they coexisted, and he needed her. But he eulogizes her. And in many other places where we read about Abraham's relationship with Sarah, we also see that he didn't really think so much about how beautiful she was, or how kind she was, or how spiritual a prophetess she was. God says to him, you have to listen to your wife Sarah. She's a higher prophetess than you. There are a couple of kings that we read about in previous Torah readings that take her because she's so beautiful. Abraham apparently doesn't notice that she's beautiful. They're on this mission. They're out to talk about God, to bring the world to a place of recognizing there's one God who's involved in the world, and they're so mission driven that apparently Abraham doesn't actually recognize all these character traits and what a special, amazing person Sarah was, because they were partners, and they were working together, and they were doing what they needed to do. So that's why it says that he eulogized her first, meaning that as he's eulogizing and he's saying all these things about who Sarah is, then he realizes what he's lost. As he's extolling her virtues and saying what a person she was, and how what she did in the world, and how she helped him, and all the different things that he said about her. We don't read what he said about her, but that he, at that point of being able to verbalize it, then he recognized what he had lost, and at that point he bewails her. So that's interesting. But the bewailing in the Hebrew is a word with one of the letters is written very small. It's a small kaf in the word for bewail, meaning that some of the grief that he felt, he didn't express openly. It was held in. I recommend a movie I watched on an airplane recently called Dr. Ruth. It's about the life of Dr. Ruth Westheimer, I think that's her name. She's the sex therapist, and she was in Germany when the war broke out. She was 10 years old. And she had a very difficult time. She was sent away to Switzerland, and she lived in an orphanage, and then she never saw her parents again. And her children and her grandchildren say they never saw her cry. They never saw her cry. And I was thinking when I was reading about Abraham, how he doesn't fully bewail her. There's a small kaf there to indicate that the crying that he did publicly was minimized. Maybe he went into his tent and cried openly, but it doesn't. It says that when he cried publicly, it was more withdrawn, and it made me think of Dr. Ruth, so to speak, who maybe the extent of the loss and the extent of the pain is so great that she couldn't let it out. You can't go there. It's too much. And perhaps that was Abraham's experience, that it was like too much and I just have to give it. So what does he do? He rose up. He got up. He didn't sit there and wail and not move on. At some point, he got up. And that's another Jewish teaching, is that yes, we mourn, and yes, we should be mourning, and we have very delineated ways in which the Jewish tradition teaches us how to mourn, that there's the days between the death of a person and the burial of the person is one time frame. We could talk about this another time. And then there's burial, and then we sit Shiva for 7 days, and then there's a 30-day period and an 11-month to 1 year period for a parent who dies. So we have different times that we separate out of the extent to our mourning, and the things that we do or the things that we don't do, going to weddings or listening to music, or the things that we do to acknowledge the pain and the loss of our loved one. So when Abraham is described in the Torah, Abraham rises up. He gets up, and it's an interesting, I read a Gemara, that an oral tradition that tells a story about two potters. They're carrying their pottery, and one's walking in front of the other. And the one in the front has this beautiful pot, and he trips over maybe a branch or something, I don't know, it's outside, he trips over and he falls down, and his pot breaks. The potter that's coming along behind him then trips over the first potter, and his vase or bowl also smashes and breaks. And the question is, who's responsible for the broken pottery, right? And the answer is, the first potter who fell on the tree is responsible for the vase, the breaking of the vase of the second potter who was coming up the rear. Why? Because the first potter didn't get up. That's what it says. Like he stayed on the ground, and because he stayed on the ground, then the second potter tripped over him. But the message, I think, that comes out of that is, at some point we have to get up. And as Jewish people, that's what we do. We're a resilient people, getting back to the idea of resiliency. We're a resilient people, and we get up. And yes, we have losses, and yes, we have tragedies and all of that, but at some point, as an individual, as a nation, or as a community, we get up and we move on. Look at Pittsburgh, or look at people after the Holocaust. Some people don't get up, and some people do get up. And as a nation, we're getting up, and we're getting up, and we're getting up. The people in Israel who are in bomb shelters, at some point they come out and they get on with life, and they continue. Yes, they have traumas, and we deal with the traumas, but there's a very important lesson to learn here about our lives of, at some point, getting up and moving on. We have to get up and move on. And maybe learning from Sarah, our foremother, that we take these experiences with us. We don't block them out, pretend they never happened. We don't forget about them. We integrate them into who we are. And hopefully we become better people because of them. Maybe we become more compassionate or kinder or more empathetic, or maybe able to listen to other people, or more able to open our souls and be genuine and vulnerable and listen to other people, through all of our own processes, that we get to that place, perhaps. So that's one of the things we continue to learn here. So Abraham rose up from the presence of his dead, and now he's going to negotiate with this man called Ephron to buy a burial site for his wife Sarah. So as you know, as I mentioned, he's burying the place where the cave of Machpelah is, where he had experienced, and he had gone into that cave and seen that Adam and Eve are buried there, and he wants to purchase this land. So originally Ephron, so it's interesting, Ephron, the root of the word Ephron, the man's name is Ephron. Afar is dust. Like that's his, that's the root of his name, is that he's like from the dust. And again, that's what we do. We put our bodies into the dust of the earth. We return to the dust of the earth. That's where our body goes, and our soul continues on. And so he has a very difficult negotiation process with Ephron, and he pays a huge amount of money for this land. And it's interesting because it talks about the land, and it says that, goes on and on and on to talk about the field, and it has a cave, and it has trees around it. So it says the field and the cave within it, and all the trees in the field with all its surrounding boundaries was confirmed. And he bought it for 400 silver shekels, which is a huge amount of money. And there's a few things here to learn, and one of them is that this is the first time where Abraham, as our forefather, buys a plot of land in the land of Israel. And this is our claim to the land. We have a claim. There are 3 times in our tradition where our forefathers or our ancestors buy land. This is one of them, when Jerusalem is purchased by King David, and when the land of Shechem is purchased. That's all written in our Torah. And the idea behind it is, one of the ideas behind it is that it's not going to be contested because we bought it, and it's in our tradition, it's in our Torah that this land was purchased by Abraham to bury Sarah, and then Isaac, and then Jacob and their wives. So this is our claim, beginning of our claim. This is the beginning of our claim that this is our land and that we bought it and we own it and it's ours. So we can go back to this purchase of the land. I want to just speak very briefly about the eulogizing that Abraham does for his wife, and the eulogies that we do for our beloved losses, the people that we lose. And there's a conversation in our Torah sources as to who the eulogy is for. Are we eulogizing for our benefit, or are we eulogizing for the honor of the deceased? And I heard a few things, so I'm going to mention them, whatever resonates with you. But one of them is that most times the eulogy is done when the dead person, our beloved, is in the room with us, is lying with us, is in the, wherever it is, the funeral home or the synagogue or wherever it's happening, in the chapel, whatever, that the dead is lying before you. And the eulogy, so the idea is that as at death, the soul begins to separate from its body. Life is the locking in of the soul and the body, and at death there's a separation, there's a beginning of the separation. And the soul hovers over its body, wants to know what's going to happen to its body. It's kind of keeping watch. And if you ever listen to people who've had near-death experiences and they're brought back to life, they have images, they have stories of themselves hovering above their bodies and seeing the medical team working on them, or seeing things that were going on far away. They can look out and they can see from above what's happening to them. And then when they come back to life, obviously they can report that what they saw, some of them, not all of them, but anyway, but it's very much consistent with our tradition that the soul hovers over the body and watching what's going on. So when a person is being eulogized, the idea is that they're listening, they hear that, they know what you're saying about them. So be careful. So one of the things that a eulogy does, is it on some level it's supposed to help us evoke tears, that we're supposed to cry when somebody dies, that there's something sad, like the fabric of life has kind of been torn, and there's something that this person's no longer needed or doesn't have a place in this world, and it brings us to tears, and those tears are important. And the eulogizing, one of the things that we do in a eulogy is that we say goodbye. There's a saying goodbye and asking for forgiveness if I've done anything. And I think, put this in your back pocket next time should never happen, but that when you're at a funeral and you're with somebody you're really close with, to ask their forgiveness. They're there. Ask them forgiveness for things you did, or you didn't mean to hurt them, or you didn't mean to do something, or whatever. Even you don't know what you did, you just ask forgiveness. It's a very powerful thing to do. It's very helpful, I think. So that's one thing to throw out there. And the idea of eulogies is that we want to learn from the person who passed away. We want to remind ourselves who this person was. What did we learn from them? And sometimes people get so old and we forget what they were. Like somebody asked me today, what did I learn from my mother? My mother died 30 years ago. And I had to really think about it. Like, what did I learn about my mother? And I think one of those things is a few things I learned about her, but just to be able to verbalize that and to be able to say it and say, oh, I got that from my mother. And how important it is for us as we continue through our lives to know who influenced us and how to be inspired by people. Like when I was saying this to this person and telling them the things I learned from my mother, I got re-inspired again, right? I want to be re-inspired by the people that have predeceased us, right? And I think that might be another reason why it's important to be buried. And sometimes it's even better to be buried close to where relatives can come visit them. Like we have this whole thing, sometimes people want to be buried in Israel. But there's also great value to be visited by your relatives, by your children, by your spouse, by your siblings, by your friends, by whoever, to come visit so that you can be re-inspired. I heard a really wonderful saying, perhaps, I don't know, that a burial site is a venue for consolation and inspiration. A venue for consolation and inspiration. I thought that hits the nail on the head. When you go and you visit the graves of your parents or whoever, that one of the things that you can gain from doing that is to be re-inspired by what they did in the world and how they influenced you. And I think that's one of the things that we learn about why the cave of Machpelah is such a powerful place for Jewish people to go. Here's where our patriarchs and matriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, are buried there. And when we go there and we remember who those people were and what they put into the world, can we take those lessons? Can we be re-inspired by those lessons? Can we try to bring some of that inspiration and some of their character traits into our lives and be kind like they were and be all the things that we might want to be, and we can be re-inspired by visiting the gravesides of these people. And yes, we can read the stories, but maybe there's some power to actually going there, going to the graveside of your parents or whoever, to be re-inspired, to be consoled and to be inspired. And so part of the eulogy is for the deceased, but it's also for the family to be inspired to understand who the person was. And sometimes during Shiva, people will come to the house and they'll tell you things about your loved one that you didn't even know. And so now you start to learn even more dimensions of this person and what they put into the world and how much they influence the world. And it's interesting because there's a conversation in the amongst the rabbis as to, let's say a person before they die says, I don't want you to sit shiva for me. I don't want you to eulogize me. I don't want you to do those things. Are you supposed to listen to the request of the person who's dying and say, okay, I won't eulogize you, or I won't sit shiva for you? And there's a conversation back and forth. I don't think there's a clear answer to that. But I remember my father said to me, don't say Kaddish for me. And but I did. And I think that maybe when we're in this world, we have a certain perspective. And then when we leave the world and we enter into a world of truth, that we're moving into another realm of being and another dimension. That what I've learned and what I kind of integrated was that at that point, when you're above that, when you're above the confines of the physical world, then you actually do want your relatives to eulogize you, and you do want them to sit shiva for you, and you do want your legacy to have some impact in the world. Like, we don't want to just leave the world and nobody know about us. We had a very tragic death in our community today. Today was a young man, I think he's 37 years old, died. And he's not from here; he's from another city, and some of us were talking today, he's just. Can we have a service here? Can we eulogize him? We don't want him just to disappear and be buried in another city and nobody get to say goodbye. We'd like to have a service for him. So actually, maybe as I'm speaking it out, maybe I'll make some inquiries and see if we can manage to put something together here in Providence to talk about this person, so that we can eulogize him, we can elevate him, we can honor him, we can learn from him, we can however we knew him, talk about it so that we can be inspired, and that his presence in our midst, in our community, doesn't just disappear. It doesn't just disappear. I think there's a value not just to us, but to the person who died. So anyway, that's what I want to say about that. So the idea of post-traumatic growth, the idea of building on our years and taking our years with us, so what's interesting is also last week at the point where we had the binding of Isaac and he's not killed, and now we have the death of Sarah, who is dying. She does die, but at the end of last week's Torah portion, we also read about the birth of Rebecca. So Rebecca is destined to be the wife of Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac. So last week we read about the birth of Rebecca, and this week we're learning about the death of Sarah. And from this, the rabbis teach us that when the sun sets, the sun rises, meaning that we have this righteous person, Sarah, who's going to die, and before she dies, there's a new righteous woman that is introduced into the world, and that's Rebecca. So before Sarah dies, Rebecca is born. And we learn that. So that's an interesting concept. Sometimes we see that in our own families where somebody dies and then immediately somebody gets born, and they're sort of wow, that's creepy, or that's weird, or that's divine, or there's something going on here. Is it odd? Is it God? There's something going on here. And this is one of the places that we learn this concept that when a righteous person dies, there's always an unrighteous person coming along behind that's gonna the sun will rise as the sun sets. So as Sarah's days are old and she's moving on and she's finished with her work in this world, then Rebecca gets born. From this week's Parsha, we also learn about Abraham becoming an old man. And we've learned about old people before, but this is the first time where Abraham ages. That he apparently looked exactly like Isaac, and you couldn't tell the difference between them. Like if you'd go up to one of them, you wouldn't know who it was because they were like identical. And Abraham asks to look older, to look different, to be aged, so to speak. And as much as we don't want to get old, perhaps one of the things we can learn is like, why would Abraham ask to look older than Isaac? Because there's a hierarchy. And maybe when we talk about a 100-year-old person, or we talk about somebody who's older, the Jewish concept is that they acquire wisdom, that they have knowledge and what to give to the next generation, and there's an honoring of the elders and so on, and so sort of hierarchy, like how we see each other, and that there's the elder people should be respected, that parents should be respected, and there's different ways that that's brought out in Jewish law, like you don't interrupt your parent and you don't sit in their seat and you don't call them by their first name, and ways to kind of like separate out that parents and children are not friends, that there's a hierarchy, there's a delineation between the previous generation and the next generation, and we separate it out. And perhaps that's borne out by Abraham saying, I want to look older, I want to be in that place where I'm perceived to be an older person with more wisdom, perhaps, and hopefully we are a little bit wiser as we grow older than we were when we were 20. All right, so she's buried in the land. Sarah's buried in the land, and it says she was 127 years old. So what's also really, really interesting is that if you fast forward to the Purim story, so if you remember Esther, she becomes the queen, and she is the princess, she is the queen, over 127 provinces. And it's not coincidental that it's 127 provinces that Esther rules over, and it's 127 years that Sarah lives. And the connection I heard through Rabbi Foreman is that there's a certain rulership that we have over, or consolidation or unifying of, in the case of Sarah, of her time, of her years, of her days, that she was able to unify them all together and make them all a part of her. So her 127 years were all building blocks that built up who she was, and she was able to unify them and rule over all of them. And so similarly, Esther, she has these 127 provinces that she rules over. So she's ruling over the space. She's uniting the provinces and the space. And that when Esther comes along, she kind of picks up the baton from Sarah. So sort of 1,000 years between the two, bringing it along. So I just point out the connection between Sarah and Esther. And the idea of building this burial plot that has boundaries, that has that it's in a field and it has trees around it that keep it delineated, the boundaries. So again, we can talk about boundaries and the importance of boundaries, and we need boundaries around us. Okay, so we need to move on because it's already very late. So let's go to the next section in this week's Torah portion. So the first section is about Abraham buying a burial plot for Sarah. He pays full price for it. He gets it, and Sarah is buried, and that he eulogizes her first, and then he cries over her, and then he gets up and he puts it, and he acquires the land of Mamre and the cave of Machpelah, and he buries Sarah there along with Adam and Eve. So the next part is where now, again, we're talking about legacy. So here's Sarah put to rest, and Sarah and Abraham together, they had done all this hard work to kind of be resilient people and to build themselves and to grow. And now the last thing that we really read about Abraham is, again, about legacy. He has a son, Isaac, and Isaac is unmarried. Isaac, I think, is 37 years old. And so at 37 years old, he's still not independent. That's maybe not what we do in our world, but at 37, Abraham is still looking out for Isaac. And he sends his servant off to another land to find a wife for his son Isaac. So this is known. This Torah portion is known as the Shidduch Torah portion. It's where where Abraham is sending his servant off on a mission. He has a mission. It doesn't tell us who the name of the servant is, although we understand that it's Eliezer. That he sends Eliezer off on a mission to find a wife for Isaac. And the character trait that Isaac is that Eliezer is looking for is he's looking for the character trait of kindness. He wants to find somebody who exhibits kindness. That's what he's looking for. And he actually makes his servant swear to him that he'll do this mission. This will be his single purpose, that he'll go and he'll swear that he'll go to the land of the Canaanites and that he'll find a wife for his son Isaac. And part of the reason why we understand that he made Eliezer swear, even though Eliezer has been this most trusted servant, Eliezer has imbibed everything that Abraham and Sarah were teaching. He's like right there. He's doing everything he's supposed to do, and yet he still has to swear that he'll do that, because we understand that Eliezer has a daughter that he also was hoping would marry Isaac. And so even subconsciously, even if he didn't consciously have that as an intention, even if we don't realize that a little bribe has an effect, the fact is it does. It has a subconscious effect. And in Jewish courts, the boundaries that are put up to prevent bribery infecting a judgment or a case or a judge or anything is so severe. Like, there's nothing. You're not even allowed to open the door for the judge. You can't do anything that would influence the decision. And so here's Eliezer, who has, even though he doesn't admit it, he has a vested interest that he has his own daughter that he wants to be the wife of Isaac. And so that's why Abraham makes him swear. So we have to be careful that we even though we sometimes think, no, we're very pure of motive and we're completely objective about something, and this is the only way. Like, I know that when in my young adult stage I was very black and white, and this is the way it is, and there's no other way. It's not any other way. It's not great at all. My husband's watching, so he's probably laughing, because that's how he really used to, like, it was. I don't think it was that. There was no grey, and I guess as I get a little bit older, I see a little bit more grey. But here's Eliezer, and even though he might not acknowledge to himself that he has a vested interest, even though he not acknowledged to himself that he might have a subconscious, a personal motive, got to be careful. And so that's why he's made to swear that he's going to go on this mission. He's going to go and do what Abraham asked him to do. Abraham is not able to do that. He's not well enough, whatever. So he goes on and he wants to find a wife for Isaac. And so he sets up a scenario of how he'll know if it's the right person. And so he sets it up. And let me see if I can read it to you. The servant took 10 camels of his master's camels, and he set out with all the bounty of his master in his hand, and made his way to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nachor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city towards a well of water at evening time, the time when women come out to draw water. And he said, Hashem, God of my master Abraham, may you so arrange it for me this day that you do kindness with my master Abraham. See, I stand here by the spring of water, and the daughters of the townsmen come out to draw. Let it be that the maiden to whom I shall say, please tip over your jug so I may drink, and who replies, drink, and I will even water your camels, her will you have designated for your servant, for Isaac, and I may know that through her that you have done kindness with my master. And no sooner had he finished speaking, and suddenly Rebecca was coming out, and she did exactly that, right? She exactly comes over and she says, I will draw water for you and for your camels. So we have Eliezer asking for water. So from there we learn, you can't always know what everybody wants. So sometimes you have to ask for what you want. So put that in your back pocket. Sometimes you can't just expect people to know what you want. So sometimes you have to ask. So he asked for water for himself. And then the kindness that Rebecca exhibits isn't just it's kindness that is mixed with chokhmah, with a wisdom, where she goes above and beyond. She has a perception that, oh, you need water, but I see you have 10 camels, so I'm assuming that they need water. So she goes above and beyond. She perceives a need that she wasn't asked about. She looks around and she sees that, oh, the camels need water too. And so she starts to, and the camels are not like a person, like you get satiated after like a jug of water. Like camels, I don't know what they're like water coolers, you know, you keep pouring water. And it was a big effort for her. It wasn't so easy. It said at the beginning, when she draws water for Eliezer, that the water rose because she was such a holy person. She was so spiritual. She was so above nature that the water rose up for her. She didn't even have to dig down into the well to get the water. The water came up to her. But that when she was then drawing water for the camels, she had to dig down because it showed that her effort. It showed that she had the sacrifice of her own physicality, that she was going to do the kindness. The kindness was more important, and she ran to do it. We saw this about Abraham, how he ran to help the travelers who were coming his way into the tent, even though he had just been circumcised and he was in pain. He ran to do the acts of kindness. He ran to welcome them and be hospitable to them. So too Rebecca runs. She runs to bring the water to the camels and put it in the trough and feed these and give these camels water. And she's running. Again, the message of running and being seize the moment. Don't let the moment go. You see something that needs to be done, like do it. Don't wait because it's gone. Right? By the time you figure out whether you want to do it or not, it's too late. So just seize the moment and do it. And so she hurries and she feeds them. She feeds these camels, and Eliezer recognizes this is the woman. Why? Because she had kindness mixed with chokhmah. It wasn't just a kindness. It was just a kindness of doing and wanting to and running to do it, but it also had an intentionality. She was thinking about it. Okay, so how else can I help this person? And what else can I do for this person? Oh, I see he has 10 camels. I have to feed the camels too, because he's not going to ask me for the camels, but the camels also need water. And so there's a huge amount of kindness that comes out of this. And perhaps maybe sometimes we can also think outside the box, you know, like, oh, I see this person struggling. They're not asking me to open the door for them, but I'm going to anticipate their need. I'm going to perceive that they have a need, even if they're not asking, and try to fill it. I haven't got a good example. Maybe somebody listening has a good example, but those are the kinds of things that we could learn from Rebecca, how to perceive a need even without being asked to fill it. And maybe in our relationships with other people, you know, you recognize, you know, somebody wants a cup of tea or somebody didn't ask you for a cookie or I don't know, whatever. So it's kind of like just go a little bit above and beyond. So there's a long negotiation and blah blah blah, and I'm not going to go into the story because I want to get to the end where Rebecca agrees to go with Eliezer and to marry Isaac, and she comes with him, and they go to they're coming towards where Isaac, and they see Isaac in a field, and what's Isaac doing in the field? He's praying. Let's see if I can find that because it's really, really lovely. So so Isaac went out to supplicate in the field towards evening, and he raised his eyes, and he saw, behold, camels were coming. And Rebekah raised her eyes and saw Isaac. And so this is their first meeting. So what's Isaac doing? Isaac is praying. And we learn, there are different places where we learn about the different prayer services in our tradition. And Isaac is associated with the afternoon prayer from this Torah reading. In the middle of the afternoon, he's in the field and he's praying. But the word used for praying, it's kind of like a meditation. It's kind of like a conversation. It's not the morning prayer, which is, thank God I'm alive. Like, I went to bed, I didn't know if I was going to survive, and I woke up, and I'm so grateful that I'm alive. Thank you, God. Like, there's a certain attitude that the morning prayer brings with it. And then the night prayer, where before we go to sleep, like, please let me rest peacefully and let me wake up in the morning. There's a prayer that goes along with the night service. But the afternoon service is a conversation. It's a more, not about life and not about death. It's about having the relationship and having a conversation with God. And what's interesting is, if you think about it, maybe that in that private, intimate conversation that we have with God, where we open ourselves up, right? So God knows what we're thinking. God knows everything, but we expose that part and we talk to God with what we want, or what we're sad about, or what we struggle with, or what we need help with, or what kind of difficulties we have, or what kind of good things we have, or what we're grateful for, or etc., 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 and what we're excited about. It's conversation. We're in conversation with God. And perhaps what Isaac is teaching us is that if we can have that kind of conversation with God, then we can have that kind of conversation with a partner, with another person, that the ability to communicate might not be easy for some people. Maybe if you're raised in a home where people talk about everything, it's easier, but not everybody is so verbal or able to put into words how they feel, or to get in touch with what they feel, or to emote, or to have a conversation, or to say it out loud, or whatever it is. And perhaps there's something here in this, what Isaac is doing in the field, where he's having a conversation with God, and there's a term for it in the tradition of meditation, hisbodedut, where you go into the field and you literally talk to God. Just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Just talk to God in your own language or with your prayer book, whatever. Just talk. Have a relationship. And perhaps whether we know how to have a relationship with another person, or we know how to have a relationship with God, that it's all the same, right? In order to have a meaningful, intimate relationship with God, we have to know how to talk to people, and vice versa. We have to know how to talk to people, we have to know how to talk to God. So here we have Isaac, who's out there in the field talking to God, and he looks up and he sees Rebecca, and, love at first sight, blah, blah, blah. But he marries her, he has to see her, and she has to see him before they agree to be married. That's very important. And that it says that that Isaac, very interesting, Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother. So here's the tent of Sarah, and we'll talk about that in a second. And he married Rebecca, she became his wife, and he loved her. So again, the order, and thus was Isaac consoled after his mother. So the order is odd on some sense, because he marries her, and then he loves her. So in our world, you have to love somebody before you marry them. But the idea, I think, here is that the love came from the commitment, came from the relationship, that he was committed to, they were committed to each other. And in that commitment, love can grow. So I heard an interesting story about a young person, teenager, who was at a meal, a Shabbat table, with his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather. So the young man, maybe he's not 15, maybe he's 20, and he says, I met this person, and I want to get married, and I love this person so much. So the father says, you don't know what love is. After 20 years, now I know what love is. And then the grandfather goes, poo, 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 you think you know 20 years after I've been married, 40 years, that's real love. And then the great-grandfather says, 40 years, 70 years. Okay, so the idea is that in the commitment, in that faithfulness, in that desire to be committed to another person, that's when love can grow. That's when you have the ability to kind of open up, and you have the ability to, or you have the desire, or you learn to love. Like, you learn to see the good in the other person. You learn to see what you can create as a unit, and the love grows from that, and the things you go through together as a couple, etc., build the love, and you see each other in good and bad, and you focus on the good, etc. So that's how you build up the love. But the love comes after the commitment, after the marriage. Then the love comes. So here it is in the Torah, like, get married and then love. But obviously you've got to set up don't take my advice right away. Like, you have to know you're marrying, and that it's a good person, and you're committed to the same things. There's a lot of other things to it, but just that within the confines of a committed relationship comes love, right? So when you've been committed to somebody for a year, it's a different kind of love than when you've been together for 50 years or 40 years or whatever it is. Like, it grows, hopefully. So he brought her into the tent. So this idea of the tent and what it was that happened in the tent. So I'm going to have to finish on this idea, but that he was consoled after his mother, meaning that his mother was this huge force in his life, and that the tent that she lived in, that what happened in this tent, that there was the divine presence in this tent, and the tent parallels the tabernacle, the Mishkan, that then gets built later after the Jews leave Egypt and they're in the desert. They build this tabernacle, which is very similar to the tent of Sarah. And what happens in this tent of Sarah? There are actually 4 miraculous things that continue to happen in this tent when Sarah was alive. That the Shabbat candles stayed lit from one Shabbat to the next, that they stayed alight. that the doors of the tent were always open, always welcoming people. They were wide open. That the bread, the challah, the bread that was baked, stayed fresh for the whole week, and that there was a divine cloud, the Shekhinah, the divine presence rested on the tent. And when Sarah died, those things ended. And when Rebecca came into the tent, they all returned. So then we understand that's how Isaac is consoled, because it's almost like, okay, again, the sun setting and the sun rising, that now he has a relationship with, a different relationship, obviously not a mother-son relationship, but a spousal relationship where he now has the partnership to go into the next phase of what he's going to put into the world. So when we learned about burying Sarah and the things that we learned from Sarah, and how even though Sarah's died, she's still alive with her lessons and her legacy and what she put into the world and who she was and what she taught us, and how we continue to learn over and over and over again who Sarah was, what she did and what she brought into the world. That even though she's not physically here, she's still alive, right? She's alive in our hearts and our minds, and how we think about her and we talk about her and we pray, evoking her all the time. And then now Rebecca as a sort of a living legacy, right? So now Isaac is consoled after his mother, and now he has a new relationship with Rebecca, and all of those miraculous things happen again. So we have the energy, the divine presence is there, the divine cloud is there, the continuous flow of divine energy into the tent, and again building. So even the idea of the Shabbat candles that don't go out, our Shabbat candles go out and then we relight them the next week, but these candles kept going, and the candle that stayed lit, the menorah that stayed lit, the ner tamid, the everlasting light that stayed lit in the tabernacle, was lit from the previous one. Like it never went out. It never went out. Right? So we're back to that idea of 120 and 7, building. You don't go back and you don't go down and up and down and up. You just keep building. And this is what our matriarchs are teaching us, that there's a capacity, there's a possibility, there's an ability to, even when things look bleak, to kind of keep building, keep looking ahead, keep taking these lessons and integrating them and becoming more because of them, and be optimistic and be hopeful and run to do good things and keep putting good energy into the world and keep praying and keep having conversation with God and keep loving relationships going, keep communicating with each other and building community. And we together as a Jewish people will be more and more resilient and will be more and more effective in elevating the world, just like when Sarah even was buried in the earth, she elevated the earth. Right? And just like when Rebecca comes into the tent, she brings back all this divine influence and this divine power that comes back into the tent. Right? What are we doing in our homes? How are we lifting our homes up? Are we inviting people in? Are we lighting Shabbat candles? Are we making bread? Are we sharing what we have? Are we, I don't know, like however we want to do that. I'm sure we can all be doing more than we're doing. For sure, I can be always doing more. So, that's what I want to say. So at the very end, God, I got to finish here. So at the very end, Abraham dies. So he dies, and who buries him? Wait, by the way, sorry, before he dies, right? So Sarah dies, and now we've got Eliezer going off to find a wife for Isaac, and when Isaac's coming to the field to pray, it says he's coming from a particular place, and the place he's coming from is where Hagar is living. Hagar was the mother of Ishmael, who Sarah told Abraham to put out of her encampment. If you remember, we talked about this before, where the influence of Ishmael on her son Isaac was not a good one, and she doesn't want him in the tent. She wants him gone, banished. And Abraham listens to his wife, and he sends Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert, where we read about this before. Hagar was the concubine, was the wife of Abraham. When Sarah dies, Isaac goes to Hagar. She changes her name. Her name is Keturah, and he remarries her, which is amazing. And he has more children by her. Okay, and at the end, when Abraham dies, who buries him? Isaac buries him, and Ishmael buries him. So even though, and there's some stories abound about how even though Sarah didn't want a relationship with Ishmael, it wasn't her son, right? It was her concubine Hagar and Abraham's son. That Abraham apparently in a couple of places goes and visits. He doesn't lose touch with Ishmael altogether. Like he still loves him. He listens to his wife and doesn't have him in his world, but he still loves him. And at the end, when Abraham dies, Isaac and Ishmael both bury Abraham. So it's interesting. The Ishmaelites and the descendants of Isaac. We're family. On some level, we both share Abraham as forefathers, and there was a coming together of the Ishmaelites and the children of Isaac, the Jews, the Israelites, burying their father Abraham. So they were able to come together at the very end. So that's the end of the Torah portion. So that's what they were able to do. So just to bring it all together, I think part of the lesson to learn from all of this is the idea of legacy. The idea of commitment, that Abraham was committed to his wife Sarah, that what they built together, that he eulogized her, he cried for her, he got up, he buried her, he bought a land in Israel. It was the first purchase of the land of Israel that we claim is also ours because of that, right? But go back to that, and then we have Isaac sending Eliezer on a mission. A very direct mission. You swear to me that you're going to do this, even though you have a vested interest. You're going to swear to me that you're going to take care of this. You're going to find someone who exhibits the kindness that's necessary. That the good eye in a person is really crucial to the kind of person that needs to be with Isaac. So Eliezer sets up this whole scenario. Please God, bring somebody who's going to take care of me and my camels. And here Rebecca comes, and Rebecca is the perfect person for Isaac. They meet each other in the field where Isaac is praying. That's where we learn about the afternoon service and meditating and conversation with God. And he's able to have a conversation with God, able to have a relationship with Rebecca. And when Rebecca comes into the tent, it brings back all the miracles, all the divine presence, all the divine flow that was there when Sarah was there, and he's consoled after his mother. Even though he was so sad that his mother had died, now he has a future with Rebecca. And at the very end, when Abraham dies, and together Isaac, these two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, bury him, and he had remarried Hagar and has children with Hagar. So that's the Torah portion. So what are we going to learn? We're going to learn to live our lives fully. To Chaya, whatever your name is, to live our lives fully, even though we know that we have an end point, but we're going to live fully because it's about what we do in this world that really matters right now. That's what we're focused on. We're focused on being the best people we can be, to be resilient, to be able to have relationships with each other, to be able to connect to each other, to be able to be on a one track, like when we have something to do, let's do it, to make sure that at the end of the day somebody says to you, what do you want to be remembered for, that maybe you can answer that question and maybe live your life with that in mind. Like what do we want to be remembered for? That's my finishing line. So